Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us at the book stage platform for Mixer.world, or as we call it, Mixers across the world. Today we have an outstanding fire chat with Manish Sabharwal, co-author of the new book Made in India, the story of Deshbandhu Gupta, Lupin and Indian Pharma. Written along with journalist Sandeep Khanna, the book details the dramatic rise of India's pharmaceutical industry and the life of Lupin founder Deshbandhu Gupta. Manish Sabharwal is also the co-founder of Teamly Services, one of India's leading human capital and staffing firms. In addition to this business ventures, he frequently advises the Indian government on employment, education, and workplace policies. The fireside chat will be hosted by Dr. Madan Mohan Rao, co-founder of Mixer.world, charter member of TiE Bangalore, and research director of Your Story Media. He is himself an author of 12 plus books on innovation, knowledge management, and digital transformation. The talk in Fireside Chat today will address issues around business leaderships, company growth, and international expansion. Other topics will be entrepreneurial opportunities for startups in pharma and biotech, global changes in the pharma industry, and success factors for tech firms in times of international conflict. Publishers of authors we have featured in our sessions include Juggernaut Books, Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, HBR Press, Springer, MIT Press, and others. If you are an author, publisher, or LitFest organizer and would like to be featured here, connect with us at brand@mxr.world. Today's session is also being live streamed on YouTube and other social media platforms. Let us now get started with today's fireside chat between Manish Sabharwal and Madan Mohan Rao. Over to you, Dr. Madan.
Thanks, Manaswi. Thanks to all of you for joining us online today for this fireside chat. It's a special honor for me to have Manish Sabharwal with us. Manish is the author of this new book, Made in India, the story of Deshbandhu Gupta, Lupin, and Indian Pharma. It's a very nice 340-page book. You guys should all get a copy of this book. It also includes 11-page timeline of the sequence of activities, the chronology of the book. There are also about 19 pictures and photographs of the company's founder, Deshbandhu Gupta, other members of the family, the team, and so on. And what I also love is every chapter begins with two or three excellent proverbs and quotes taken from the scriptures, taken from experts from around the world. So it's a very nice, multifaceted read. In fact, there are actually three stories in one book. There is the story of the founder of the book, of the company. There's the story of the company itself, Lupin. There's the story of the Indian pharmaceutical industry, and maybe I would even add there's the story of the rise of India in this as well. So there are four stories woven together in this very compelling book, and I've scribbled a lot of my notes in the margins of this book and all that stuff. So if you want to borrow the book from me, be prepared to get distracted by my markings, but much better if you buy your own copy of the book. To give you a good insight of what's happened in this book, I'm going to invite Manish now to take over for the next 15, 20 minutes or so. He's going to tell us his story in writing the book, how we got the idea, the ups and downs of the whole process, the theme of the book, the topic, and so on. Manish, thank you so much for joining us. I've heard you many times in literature festivals and panels across the country. It's great to have you on this forum here. Manish, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Madan. That was a very generous introduction. I grew up in Kashmir and I grew up listening to a wonderful Sufi concept of Lawh-e-Azal, which is the tablet of destiny or the book of eternity, where everything that happens to everybody is written. But I think this book was, for me, a notion or defies the notion of Lawh-e-Azal, right? There are three journeys, Indian Pharma, Lupin, and DB Gupta, who defy the notion of destiny. And, no economist would predict that a country with $2,800 per capita income would be making 55% of the world's medicines. Indian pharma is an industry, or pharmaceuticals is an industry that you would associate with developed countries. Yet, and you don't associate factories with India, we associate manufacturing with China. Yet, Indian pharma is the world's biggest maker of world's medicine. So it's an industry that should not exist. Lupin is a company which is started in 1968. It's 7 years after its founder. It still thrives. It's had a generational transition. It is the world's largest maker of TB medicines, though it makes no money on that. But that's where it started, and it has kept it alive. Some out of nostalgia, but also out of cold business sense, right? 75% of their revenues are other kinds of respiratory medicines, which are an adjacency from tuberculosis, right? Companies are path dependent, history matters. And so by starting in tuberculosis, lupin is now growing in respiratory. But that journey of a company was interesting. And then obviously, D.B. Gupta was born in a household without electricity or water in a small village in Rajgarh in Rajasthan. His father was a teacher, his grandfather was a teacher, his great grandfather was a teacher. And the first three jobs D.B. Gupta had were a government school teacher, a college lecturer, and a university professor. It is highly unlikely for somebody whose role models around them were teachers and whose first three jobs were as a teacher to have gone to Bombay. But all three of these journeys were catalyzed almost by external events. So Indian pharma is a child of regulatory policy. And for somebody who's cribbed about regulatory cholesterol for 20 years, maybe writing this book was an appropriate sort of paschatap for that. Because without the 1970 Patents Act and the 1984 Hatch-Waxman Act, Indian pharma would not exist. So 1970 Patents Act was in India where the government said, because in 1960s medicines cost more in India than they did in Europe, and most of the Western companies were just moving away from infectious diseases to sort of lifestyle diseases, which is not what India's disease transition happened only in the 90s from infectious to 90s. The 1970s, the Indian government said we will not allow process patents, product patents, we will allow process patents. Multinationals got upset. Many of them left India. In 1970, among the top 10 pharma companies in India, there was only one Indian company. Today, out of the top 10 Indian pharma companies, there is only one multinational. So the 1970 Patents Act led to an entrepreneurial response where, Parvinder Singh of Ranbaxy, Dilip Sanghvi of Sun Pharma, Wockhardt, Khurakiwala, Yusuf Hamid of Cipla, D.B. Gupta of Lupin, Ramanbhai Patel of Zydus, Cadila. I mean, they all recognized the opportunity and they were all using chemistry because at that point, pharmaceutical was all chemistry. And this pharmaceutical revolution that happened in India because of the 1970 Patents Act got a rocket because of the 1984 Hatch-Waxman Act, where drugs which went off patent never really lost prices because they didn't have competition. But in Ronald Reagan in 1984 passed the Hatch-Waxman Act, which allowed them to sort of recognize that generics will be given a pathway to launch their drugs in India, in the US. And so the pharmaceutical companies in India, which had learned how to make drugs because the Patents Act took advantage of the 1984 Hatch-Waxman Act. And today, Americans ate 400 billion pills last year. 200 billion of them are made in India. So Indian pharma's journey was catalyzed by policy. I think D.B. Gupta's journey was catalyzed by another accident of history. D.B. Gupta's final job was as a chemistry professor at BITS Pilani. And he got fired from that job because he took the Indian Air Force exam. When he didn't pass that exam because he had a lifelong limp and hearing issues because of his father couldn't afford medical health care when he was young. And so he passed the written exam but failed the physical. So when he went back to Pilani, the administrators told him that you're not allowed to take exams without our permission. So he said, what do you mean? I don't need anybody's permission to serve the nation. They said, actually, you do. You look at your contract, either you quit or um, we will fire you. So he said, I'm not going to quit. So they fired him. So he took a train to Bombay and started Lupin. I was recently at BITS Pilani. I told them we should endow a chair for firing him because he's my father-in-law. And of course, he would never have started Lupin and never become an entrepreneur. So I think for me, this writing this book, I'm an entrepreneur myself. My parents were in the police. They were civil servants. They grew up in the license Raj. They grew up in a period where you had to have connections or capital to start a company. And for me, I am a child of post-liberalization, right? I graduated from college the year liberalization happened. So for me to set up India Life and Team Lease, I raised venture capital, private equity. The environment was not as hostile to entrepreneurs as it is right now, as it used to be in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So for me, it was particularly fascinating because not many pre-licensed Raj companies have survived and thrived after 1991. Um, Animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle. And suddenly it's now clear to me that we have industries in India where first generation entrepreneurs, you don't have to have money to start money. And DBG didn't have money and he took debts and he ran into lots of trouble. So I think for me in the writing of this book, the external events also gave me a view of entrepreneurship. I've always wondered about entrepreneurship. Do people create history or does history create people, right? The social science view of literature or of history and the literature view of history. The social science view is this Karl Marx and Tolstoy, who says that people don't matter, circumstances are all that matter. While the literature view of history is Carlyle or Will Durant, who say that the history of the world is the biography of its leaders. And that brings you to the question of luck or skill, right? But as you get older, you realize luck and skill are probably the wrong framing. There are lots of lucky people I know who are completely unskilled. There are lots of skilled people who are completely unlucky. So I think it boils down to choices. Dumbledore tells Harry Potter in Chamber of Secrets, it is our choices more than our abilities that reveal what we really are. And so there was a bunch of enchanting policy choices. There was a bunch of enchanting entrepreneurial choices. What are the things that in retrospect, I learned from this about entrepreneurship? Well, the first most important one is that DBG was an unlikely entrepreneur. Maya Angelou says the universe isn't made of atoms, it is made of stories, which in real life means that the role models around you really matter for your choices. And DBG would have been a teacher if he hadn't been filed for this. And so misfortune can lead to fortune in some sense, but it can also lead to choices. The second is policy and entrepreneurship can dance together. I grew up, or I work a lot with government where the tug of war metaphor that, for one side to win, the other side has to lose between government and entrepreneurs existed. But pharmaceuticals is an example where instead of a tug of war metaphor, you had a dance metaphor where policy enabled the creation of a fertile habitat, which entrepreneurs then took to the next level. I think the notion that you sort of multinationals have unfair advantages is something all of us also grew up with. My parents were civil servants. They would always say, "Usko अच्छी नौकरी मिल गई, वो multinational के लिए काम करता है." And to their civil servant mind frame, multinationals were proxies for people who paid more salary because they had higher productivity because of their investments in technology, talent, or process. But as I said, now there's only one multinational among the top 10, right? When in 1991 reforms began, we thought that India would become like the Wimbledon, right? It's played in England, but no Britisher ever wins. And we thought multinationals would take over. But as we've seen in late, multinationals are now losing out to Indian car makers. They definitely lost out to Indian banks. They're losing out to Indian FMCGs. They've definitely lost out in Indian pharma. In my mind, I sometimes think MNCs are the new PSUs, but I may be biased. I think that an important distinction to think about is that Indian pharma's future is different from its past. That is a lesson on which I end the book because the past 50 years, pharmaceuticals has been chemistry, now it's biology. So the challenges that have happened from China, even though we make 50% of the world's medicines, we haven't been very good at discovering new medicines. But China last year discovered one third of the world's new medicines. I think the move to biologics and biology is an important challenge for us. I think there are many strengths which Indian pharma has, but it makes 55% of the world's medicines, but only gets 6% of the world's revenues. So out of the $1.4 trillion in pharmaceutical revenues, Indian pharma only makes $60 billion. It's a little different from software. Software is 90% exports, but Indian pharma sales in India and its exports are exactly equal. They're $30 billion each. So its pharmaceutical is different from the past. That is obvious to me. But what did I learn specifically as an individual and as an entrepreneur? I think the key is to balance the next quarter and quarter century is a very hard act for every entrepreneur, but Indian pharma and particularly DBG did that very well. DBG set up his first US FDA factory 10 years before it sold a single piece of drug in the US. So I think you need to, a 10-year plan is not 10 one-year plans. And as entrepreneurs, I sometimes find myself making 10 one-year plans. But pharmaceuticals is an example of where sort of taking the long view and balancing the next quarter and quarter centuries. The other one would be balancing thinking and doing. The old political adage of you campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose applies to entrepreneurs. We write our business plans or we do our IPO roadshows in poetry, but we execute and we scale our companies in prose. One is not better than the other, right? Too much poetry and no prose, you do nothing, but too much poetry and no prose, you do nothing great. So the question of how do you balance thinking and doing is really in the cognitive diversity of the team. And as I studied Lupin and DBG's way he crafted his team and surrounded himself by people he was a doer more than thinker in the early stages. He moved to being a thinker, but his instinct was always doing. So he had people around him who were thinking. My father was in the police. He used to carry around a quote in his office through his careers, which was by Thucydides, a Peloponnesian general. He said, any army that has too much of a gap between its thinkers and doers will have its fighting done by fools and its thinking done by cowards. And I think as entrepreneurs, we have to sort of recognize this in some sense. The final one is sort of balancing brains and brawn. I met a unicorn entrepreneur of last week and I asked him, what is your strategy? And he says, well, my strategy is raising more money than my competitors. And I think DBG and many of the pharma entrepreneurs who were very frugal in building their companies in terms of capital would have been horrified by that, right? Because again, military strategy, Field Marshal Rommel used to say, sweat saves blood, blood saves lives, but brain saves both. Right? Military strategy moved a long time away from brawn to brains as the wars in Ukraine and even in the Gulf are showing right now that God is not on the side of the biggest armies, but the best shots. That same thing applied to the creation of Indian pharma. The amount of capital they used to create these companies was such a fraction of what many of the current unicorns use. Now, maybe the world has changed, but finally, as an entrepreneur, I realize people go back and forth. Sometimes they say grow your revenues at all costs, then they say grow your profit at all costs, but that comes in and out of fashion. I think return on equity, which is how much money you spend to make how much money you make, is probably the only evergreen metric for entrepreneurs to think about in the long run. So I think if you think about Indian Pharma, Lupin, and DBG, these are three journeys which should not exist. They have a lot of lessons for us. I've tried to capture some of those lessons in the book, but as every author knows, the minute you print a book, you feel that you could have done so much different in it and written it differently. But the book is out there now, and in my mind, Indian pharma and software are important reminders of what India can be. We are an ancient civilization finding our modern voice. India and China had the same per capita GDP in 1990. Today, China is 5 times more than us. They don't work harder than us. They are not smarter than us. Yet, why are they 5 times more prosperous than us is a question that I now answer about India's sort of queasy relationship with entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. And this book to me was important to show when policy and entrepreneurs dance how we can add mass prosperity to mass democracy if India renegotiates its relationship with entrepreneurship. But I'll pause here and then we can jump into questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Manish. You've packed a lot of stuff in the book and in the fireside chat so far. You've talked about some of the stories of the founder, the ups and downs, the twists and turns of his journey. You've packed some lessons, trends in the industry, and so on. So I'm going to ask you a few sets of questions, some about the book, some about the industry itself.
Mhm.
I'm going to begin with you on the book. What made you choose pharma as a sector? As you mentioned, there's a lot written about the IT sector, but you could have picked, I don't know, manufacturing, you could have picked electronics, any other sector. What made you pick pharma?
I mean, there's a good answer and an honest answer to your question. The good answer is that pharma is one of India's globally competitive industries. And it's a role model for what India can do. The honest answer is, last year I wrote a book with my father, and this was a book about my father-in-law. so, so the honest answer is sometimes it's harder, it's easier to look inside. And last year I wrote a book on Kashmir. It's called Kashmir Under 370 with my father. And this year I wrote a book about my father-in-law. So the two subjects were close to home, so I didn't have to choose them as much as they chose me.
Great. You also mentioned that you've tied together three themes: the founder, the company, the industry. So, how did you think of weaving all these together? Each by itself is a story, but you picked three different things and you stitched them all together. So, how did you think of this structure and the flow?
See, as you get older, I handed over team leads a few months ago after 25 years to a CEO, right? Suparna, who used to run Titan Watches, is now the MD of team leads. And many people were surprised. Many people were worried, what do you do with yourself now? And how do you think about it? As you get older, you recognize that life is a palindrome, right? It comes from country to industry to company to entrepreneur, but it also goes from entrepreneur to company. I could not have set up Team Leads 25 years ago. I'm 50 years ago. The entrepreneurial environment was too hostile. I don't think Lupin could have been set up or would have met its destiny without the Hatch-Waxman Act and the 1970 Patents Act. There is no way DBG couldn't have known about these exogenous shocks, or you may call them pieces of luck, that really made Lupin live up to its destiny, or even Sun Pharma and so many others. So I think as I was writing the book, frankly, I did start with making it about DBG. But then I realized that he himself used to acknowledge that Lupin would not have reached its destiny without those two pieces of luck, which was the Hatch-Waxman and the 1970 patents. So, and then as I spoke to all the other pharma entrepreneurs, including like Dilip Sanghvi, G.V. Prasad, Hamid, and many others in pharma, they all were humble enough to acknowledge that without the external environment being wind at their back, they would not have reached their destiny. So then it just became obvious that these three journeys were concurrent, they were mutually reinforcing, and they were also romantic in their own way.
And how long did it take you to write all this stuff? I mean, you mentioned that you did another book last year. So, in between running your company and digging up the research about the founder, the company, the industry, the policy, all that stuff, how long did it take you? And what was it like to realize that wow, the book is almost done now, and then to finish it?
Oh, there is no such thing as a manuscript. There is only a deadline. And I wanted to get this book out. I mean, the reality is that I wrote my father's book a year after my mother passed, even though my mother wanted it to be written. So with DBG's book, my mother-in-law is still around, and it became important for me to have this book out in the world while she was still around. So I rushed that book. I think it took almost 3.5 years to write, but the beauty this time round was I had a co-author, a very talented co-author called Sandeep Khanna. He's been a business journalist. He's done some books before. So having Sandeep as a co-author was very important to take some of the load, and that's how I was able to do it concurrently along with the other things I did. But once I decided that I wanted a deadline for it, it was important to have Sandeep and me both carry the load. So the reality is, you don't write a book, you rewrite a book. The reality is, I mean, we have published probably our 22nd draft, if not our much. I mean, people think of the notion that of creativity where you jump out of a bathtub saying Eureka is how people think you write a book, that you sit down on a table and you write a book. At least my experience is that you don't write a book, you rewrite a book. So over the last three, we probably had a working draft within a year. But I think the last 2.5 years have been spent in converting that working draft into a coherent arc of narrative, in thinking about the appropriate quotations to start every chapter with, to think about what is the right connectivity between one chapter and the next, thinking about the best way to end a chapter, thinking about too much detail which bludgeons the reader, but not enough detail which doesn't add enough credibility. So there's these millions of choices that you have to make in writing a book, which probably took the 2.5 years after we had a draft in a year and a half.
If you had to do one more edit now, what would you do? once you completed the book, did you look back and say, "Oh my God, I forgot to add this part," or someone told you, "Hey, you forgot this other thing"? If you could go back, would you add anything now, or you're very happy with the
I
current?
think it would be more about DBG's state of mind, right? See, as authors, you always hesitate, especially with somebody who had passed. I mean, I knew DBG for 17 years. But I think many people have come back and saying, how did he make those decisions and how did he make those choices, right? What were his struggles? So I would have spent more time with my mother-in-law and the kids in understanding how did he come to some of those decisions, right? So in some sense, it would be a little bit of literary nonfiction, which maybe my co-author would be, I would be editorializing, I would be creating stuff. But I think the world of fiction and nonfiction are anyway, the partition isn't as much as you think. And as nonfiction becomes the primary vessel by which most people consume books, or at least last year it was 80-20 fiction, nonfiction, fiction. I think I would have made the book a little more of the human aspects of DBG would be more in there.
Correct. Yeah. Let's move now from books to literature in general.
Mhm.
Some of the very common themes in business literature are what happens when a leader hands over the company to someone else, they hand over to the next generation, and so on. So I guess Lupin's gone through, I guess, two generations of leaderships. Where is it going now, and what's your sense of how does it compare to other companies with leadership succession issues?
See, convert a first generation entrepreneur's company into an institution too early and you take away its birthright. But too late, you take away its destiny, right? You campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Institutionalization is inevitable for people who want to scale. See, as an entrepreneur, there are two kinds of companies you can create: a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. The difference between a baby and a dwarf is not more food, or it's not more money, right? It is in DNA. And I think DBG's transition from a founder-led company to an entrepreneur-managed company to an entrepreneur-governed company, those are three distinct phases. The founder-led phase was probably the 70s. The founder sort of managed was the 80s, and then the founder governed came in the 2000s. This transition was very difficult. The 90s was a lost decade for Lupin, right? Because as founder, for most companies, the IPO is the crowning event of your company. But for Lupin, the IPO was the beginning of 10 years of hell. They used that money to diversify into real estate. They made massive investments in plants which didn't work out. So from 1992 to 2002 is a period I cover in the book where DBG went through a lot of mental agony. He went through personal challenges. The market cap crashed 90%. The company almost went bankrupt. But thankfully it didn't. And it not only did it not recover, it recovered vociferously under immediately. And then once Nilesh and Vinita, DBG's son and daughter, took over, they have taken the market cap to much higher levels than it was ever there when DBG was running the company. So I think what allowed this transition to function was after the crisis, DBG reevaluated his role as a shareholder, as a founder, and as a board member and as a chief executive, right? He got Kamal Sharma, who was a professional with him in the early years, but had drifted away back as managing director. So he separated the executive role from his board member role from his shareholder role. His shareholder role still exists. DBG never sold a share of Lupin in his life, and he always viewed that as sort of sacrilege. So I think the transition from DBG to Kamal Sharma, and then from Kamal Sharma to the kids, was a very important mezzanine layer and bridge layer, which facilitated the company. Now, in 2000, when at the end of the crisis, Lupin's market cap had come down to 400 crores. It is now almost 1,40,000 crores. So it is so these two transitions of, I think every entrepreneur has three roles: your shareholder role, your board member role, and your chief executive role. I don't think all three roles are concurrent and they are guaranteed, and nor are they for life. But many people think so. So I think the crisis made DBG evaluate those three roles, partition them, and then successfully think about the transition. And then obviously, he did a good job with educating his kids. Lupin, five kids, two are doctors, one is a Harvard MBA, one's a Wharton MBA, and one is a Kellogg MBA. So they weren't spoiled rich kids. And two of them, Vinita, who went to Kellogg, got her MBA there, Nilesh went to Wharton, are now running the company, and have done a great job. So I think preparing for your transition, thinking about your three distinct roles, and ensuring your kids aren't spoiled brats are probably the best advice.
That's great. You unpacked a lot of good lessons from them. Another good theme in your book is how you talk about risk. That in the early stages of an entrepreneur's journey, there's a lot of time to experiment and take risks. But once you become a large company and once you have a lot of shareholders, you've got to be much more cautious in the risk. So, how do you manage this as an entrepreneur? What are the lessons that this book gives from how to go from risk taking to risk managing, risk minimizing in a company's growth?
I mean, I wouldn't belabor that point, and for that reason, the first three words of the book are Vir Bhogiva Sundara, which is the brave shall inherit the earth. See, we value many virtues: kindness, empathy, patience, but I think the most valuable one is bravery. First of all, because bravery can't be faked. Second of all, because bravery makes the other virtues much more valuable. So I think the notion of bravery, which is courage, to my mind, is why this industry exists. There was policy bravery, on which was the Patents Act. There was entrepreneurial bravery, which was the creation of this industry. And now there has just been ambition bravery because many industries in India did not go global. But pharma went global, and that has made it stronger, right? Because it has learned to compete with the best in the world. So I think that risk taking is obviously important. Risk management is an inevitable consequence of institutionalization. The question is, how do you make sure risk management is not risk aversion? Because every company, every time you double your revenues, you have to reinvent yourself as a company. Sometimes the same people don't work, sometimes the same org structure doesn't work, sometimes the same products don't work. But as you get bigger, your risk aversion increases because you replace your entrepreneurs with corpocrats. Corpocrats are more interested in keeping the trains running on time rather than getting a new train out of the station. So, what is the madhyam marg between risk management, risk aversion, and risk taking? Is something every company and entrepreneur has to find for themselves. But the companies that choose bravery over preservation, I think, are the ones that endure over long periods of time.
Thanks, Manish. There's another theme which comes quite often in the book, which is the need to diversify versus the need to focus. So there are some business authors who've written a lot about core competency, stays focused on one area. Other people say you must have a conglomerate kind of a strategy that might work better. And Lupin itself kind of swayed a couple of times between focused only on some products, then they diversified. Other countries came back to one country. So how where is the focus in this dance between focus and diversification, portfolio and a single focus?
I don't think it's a coincidence that pharma and software companies are global leaders because most of them do one business, right? Except for TCS, but TCS is run as a standalone company practically. Germans have this wonderful word called Fingerutspell. You develop intuition in your fingers by doing the same thing for 20 years. It's basically about compounding. It's another word for the 10,000 hours. As I have gotten older, I have really turned away from the benefits of diversification and conglomerates. I think it's very important for you if you want to be a global company. I mean, it's very hard to run one company. How will you run 10 companies? The intuition, the judgments, the networks, the experience that comes and it takes to build a global company are not things that you can spread yourself widely. The notion that I'm an entrepreneur and I can be an entrepreneur in any business is probably useful in businesses where you deal with the government a lot. It's because then regulatory arbitrage is a key skill that you develop, which is why in the license charge diversification was rewarding. But I think animals bred in captivity find it hard to live in the jungle. And I think companies which do one thing, do it well, develop those capabilities, focus on their talent, develop on brands, develop and make investments in technology, don't always benefit from diversification. So now, at least I think that Germans are onto something with their notion of Fingerutzspel, or you can just call it compounding, right? I think compounding is a very powerful concept which the human mind sort of doesn't understand. Whenever I go to teach in business schools, I tell kids, you have to answer me in 5 seconds. Will you take 10 lakhs right now, or will you take one paisa doubling a day for 31 days? Obviously, most people take 10 lakhs, but one paisa doubling a day is 1 crore 6 lakhs in 31 days. But there's a catch here. Till the 24th day, you're better off taking 10 lakhs. The real chunk comes in the last 6 days, right? So the benefits of compounding only come in the last 10-20% of the time. So sometimes, so I think compounding is hard for people to understand, but the basic lesson of compounding is determination and patience and persistence over long periods of time.
Manish, you talked about two, 3 points about entrepreneurship. You said India must get more comfortable with the importance of entrepreneurship, and you just mentioned business school. Suppose this book were to be used as a case study in a business school. How do you think this book should be taught? And in a broader scheme of things, how well is entrepreneurship education doing in India?
Well, I mean, there's so many problems with your question. Can entrepreneurship be taught? Are entrepreneurs made? How do you think about that question is the heart of your question, right? I mean, the further away I get from my MBA, I realize that I learned many kinds of stuff, which is sort of marketing, finance, the technical skills, accounting, and stuff like that. But they are much less important than teaching me how to be more kind, how to be more patient, how to be more courageous, how to be more this thing. And none of that is something that business schools know how to teach, right? So the question is, the non-cognitive skills in the long run are more valuable than cognitive skills, right? But the challenge is young students in business schools don't always understand that. And most teachers don't know how to teach that, right? So in a world of AI, in a world where Google knew everything, but now we live in a world of AI where AI understands everything. So the question for us really is, how are we going to move from being a business school that teaches technical skills to being something where you learn how to be an entrepreneur? So the book's three journeys, you had asked the question that why did you expand a biography of an entrepreneur to being a history of a company to being the history of the industry? Because I think as you get older, you realize that context really matters. When you go upstream from an entrepreneur and a company, you realize that regulations matter. You realize that so many society's permission matters, right? I don't think the 1970 Patents Act was a huge blow in some sense to intellectual property for 35 years. Many US pharma companies still say Indian pharma entrepreneurs are pirates. They use the government to take away our intellectual property and build their companies. But life is complicated. Medicines in India were more expensive than Europe. So how would you allow that happen? So I think this book should be taught as a combination of how public policy danced with entrepreneurs, of how entrepreneurs create babies rather than dwarfs, and of how individuals should not be defined by their opening balance. That in team leads, over the last 25 years, we've hired somebody every 5 minutes, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. So if there's anything I've learned, it is the two most important decisions a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and your PIN code wisely. But I would submit that DBG's life from and journey from Rajgarh to creating Lupin, which is now worth 1,40,000 crores, defies the destiny of choosing your PIN code, because Rajgarh is, I visited Rajgarh a few times in the writing of the book, and it hasn't changed in the last 50 years. It still is frozen in time. But DBG changed his PIN code, and his parents were teachers, which was a very useful gift for him. But they didn't have money to let him start the company or the connections. So I think hopefully the book will be taught as policy. Hopefully the book will be taught as entrepreneurship. But most importantly, it will be taught as how you can escape your opening balance.
Wow, that's a great takeaway about the book. I want to switch more to where the world is now compared to the early days when DBG first started this company. So we've got a very mature startup ecosystem now. I want to ask you, what do you see as some of the opportunities for entrepreneurs in the pharma sector today, in the biopharma sector today, and how's the whole ecosystem helping them? So if DBG had to start today, what would be very differently for the people who are starting now as compared to when he started?
Oh, I mean, that world has completely changed. Chemistry is moving to biology. Drug discovery will be revolutionized by AI. Drug production is going to be revolutionized by automation and by robotics. Drug distribution is finally being revolutionized by e-commerce. There's all kinds of changes, and some of them are passing showers, some of them are climate change, right? And that is true for every industry at any point in time. So I think predicting where the industry will go is harder than saying the industry's biggest challenge is moving from volume to value. Now, that is what is their binding constraint in moving from volume to value? Anji Reddy always used to say the biggest test of Indians' drug industry will be the discovery of new medicines. But less than 1% of the 5,000 new medicines discovered in the world in the last 2 decades have come from India. But last year, China became one third of new medicines licensed in the world, right? Because 20 years ago, and they were practically zero, they made a commitment to investment in basic science, investment in universities. So while Indian pharma companies spend about 8% of their revenues on R&D, globally pharma companies spend about 5%. Corporate India only spends 1%, so obviously pharma is higher than that. But I think more spending on R&D, more contract manufacturing, more discovery, more shifting to biology are all areas of entrepreneurial opportunity. The specific ones will be depending on the combination that entrepreneurs come up with. I think policy has created an enabling environment. My favorite professor of economic development is Ricardo Hausman at Harvard. He says development is a game of Scrabble. The government provides the vowels and the private sector provides the consonants. And entrepreneurship is making longer words and more words. In the license Raj, we made 2 letter words, 3 letter words. Pharmaceutical is a 25-letter word, right? But biosimilars are a 35-letter word. But now all the vowels that entrepreneurs need are on the table. So it's up to entrepreneurs to combine all this in ways that I think will happen.
Thanks, Manish. Another big area of change in the world today compared to many years ago is the kinds of conflict we're seeing today. There's a lot of supply chain disruption, there's stuff going on even as we speak in the Middle East, other areas. So it's very important for Indian industries, especially pharma, to become much more resilient. What are some ways in which you think this can happen, and what are lessons from the book in how to become more resilient?
See, the problem with resilience is it implies import substitution. It implies going back to the silly drafting of India's economic policy that happened in the 1955 Avadi Resolution and the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan. See, despite Trump's assault on the trade system, Chinese exports are up to the US over the last 2 years. So the reality is that it's hard to secede from the world in today's world. I mean, supply chains are very hard to replicate. Why haven't China's factories moved to India? Apple has moved to India. We now make 25% of Apple's iPhones, but Apple's supply chain has not moved to India. China's value add in iPhones is 40%. India's value add in iPhones started with 2.5%. It's up to 12.5%. But 37 and a half, 12 is 27 and a half is still left in China because the supply chain is very hard to move. And it may not move. And I'm not sure that every country is going to make everything that it consumes for everything that it exports is probably not going to be viable. So I understand, well, post COVID, there was worry about resilience. Post war, there is worry about resilience. I think we will find the Madhyam Marg where we were independent of saying that supply chains don't matter, where any resilience. So to move from just in time to just in case does not imply Atmanirbharta of everything. It implies Atmanirbharta of the critical parts of your value chain. So I think we are still in a process of negotiation, or a process of renegotiating globalization. and that'll happen soon.
Got it. Another big change in the ecosystem from the early days to today is investors. There's much more investment in this space now. What's your sense on the investor outlook for those who are looking at the pharmaceutical sector? In our audience, we've got a few investors from Thai, Bangalore, and other organizations. What's your take on how should investors be looking at pharma? What should they look at? What lessons can they take from Lupin's example and from your book?
I mean, see, in the short run, investing, as Benjamin Graham used to say, was is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine. Pharma has gone through its ups and downs between 17 and for Lupin, there was a big crisis between 1992 and 2002 where where investors brought their market cap down 90%. Between 2017 and 2022, there was a big challenge for pharma because generic prices in the US crashed. Pharmacy benefit managers really squeezed Indian manufacturers, their profits scrapped, and Lupin's market cap went down again 50% from its peak. But it has now come back because they have started doing complex generics rather. They've started moving to specialty products. They've innovated in delivery systems. So I think the notion of investors always chasing new things rather than companies who know how to reinvent themselves. I mean, we don't have an early stage investing community for biotechnology, which is an important part of the ecosystem because big companies are not always going to be able to innovate. So I think there is a huge opportunity for investors to look at Indian biotech, to think about Indian pharma companies who have different views of the world. You know, Lupin is focusing on US specialty generics, it's focusing on emerging markets. Divi Labs is focusing on becoming a contract manufacturer. Dr. Reddy's is focusing on different therapies. Sun Pharma has made a different. So there's a lot of diversity in business models also emerging across the pharma companies. So I think pharma as a sector, as an asset allocation, should be important for investors. But I think moving to the next level of granularity to decide which business plan are you more comfortable with is probably more important.
Thanks, Manish. You talked a lot about the good opportunities. Let's talk about some of the challenges now in the last couple of questions. One is quality. In your book, you mentioned many times that many of the inspections and crackdowns on the pharma sector outside of the US have been in India. So, what do we do to move the needle in terms of quality, not just in the pharma sector, but overall? Is there something that we're missing in this quality consciousness in Indian business?
See, I think there's a lot of learning by doing. My favorite question for every sports coach or music maestro is what matters more to make a champion or a maestro? Fitrat, talim, or sort of riyaz, right? Fitrat is your nature, riyaz is your hard work, and talim is your sort of learning. And most of them say, well, it's you can't do one without the other two, right? Champions require the hard work, they require the learning, and they require the instinct. So I think quality is a journey. I don't think there's anything culturally wrong with. I don't like cultural explanations for poverty or quality, right? There was this idiot economist at the Delhi school who called it the Hindu rate of growth, right? Between 1820 and 1950, India grew at 0.1%. Between 1950 and 1991, India grew at 2%, so he called it the Hindu rate of growth. But from 1991 till now, we've grown at 7%, and we didn't shoot all the Hindus. So clearly, there was an incomplete, if not a bigoted explanation. So I think the notion that Indians have higher quality problems was true in the early stages of FDA inspections, but now there is no statistical dispersion or distinction between US FDA inspection observations and Indian inspection observations. The fact that India has such a large proportion of US FDA authorized factories, if you adjust for that, I think now Indian pharmaceutical companies have figured out how to deliver quality. But obviously, just like liberty is the eternal vigilance is for democracy, and protecting liberty is a constant battle. Quality is a constant battle. But I would say that for Indian pharma, quality manufacturing is no longer their binding constraint as much as innovation.
Got it. Thanks. So it's good to know that the needle has moved, so to speak, in the pharma sector.
Yes.
What about R&D? You mentioned earlier that Indian investment, I guess, corporate and government in the pharma sector or in other sectors as well, is not where it should be. We need much more investment in R&D for innovation and so on. Fundamental science, fundamental pharma, bio. What's your take on how to move the needle in that space?
I mean, We are a country with a per capita income of $2,500. The US, despite Trump's drama with Harvard, Harvard gets $90,000 per student per year from the government for research, for largely for research and development, right? Johns Hopkins get $110,000 per student per year. So the reality is that the US state has made massive investments in basic science. MIT was a creation of World War II. Stanford was a creation of the Cold War, which means that Silicon Valley was a creation of the Cold War's DARPA investments, right? So I think that the Indian state obviously has to do investments in basic science because it's very hard. You want people to think for the heck of it, right? Without their, basic scientists, you need scientists to think about ideas which they may not be able to commercialize because then that can be commercialized online. The challenge for the Indian state at this state is public debt is reaching almost 80%. We have huge fiscal constraints. So where will you find the money? We are raising defense expenditure, we're raising our welfare expenditure. So we have to find money for science expenditure. The government is trying the new ANRF, the new initiatives of basic science investment are almost 1.5, 2 lakh crores, which is a huge leap from what it was a few years ago. But Harvard's endowment is $50 billion. These are numbers that are very hard to cope with. So I think a combination of reimagining our university system by giving universities more freedom and having more quality universities, by partnering a better partnership between the corporate sector and universities, by more public sector, by reinventing CSIR. They spend 40,000 crores, and I don't think we get as much return on investment. CSR needs to learn from ISRO on how to, commercialize government spending. So I think there are a number. It's not solely in the eyes. I think the pharmaceutical industry has a responsibility to raise its R&D expenditure from 8% of revenues to maybe 10 or 12%, which all of them have committed to. But I think India's salvation of renewing our intellectual infrastructure, as the Buddha used to say, Atma Deepo Bhav, right? Be your own light. Renewing our universities, renewing our think tanks, renewing our books, renewing our schools is all linked to the human capital. Human capital is the only renewable energy any country has.
Thanks, Manish. We're almost out of time. I'm going to end up by going back to my very first questions, which is about the book. What's your next book going to be about?
Oh, that's impossible to predict because as I mentioned, these last two books picked me. I didn't pick them. My father in Kashmir I was born and brought up in Kashmir, and after 370, I felt strongly about that. Obviously, with my father-in-law, his company is 20 times my company's size. That's always challenging, and so I thought that my best honor to him would be a book about him. But I think a large part, I think about why India is poor. I have spent the last 20 years on why India is poor. I don't think there's a cultural explanation for that. I think the unfinished transformation is the relationship between the Indian state and entrepreneurs. And I don't want to make it a book about economics. I want to make it a book about entrepreneurship. Unlike what most people think about China's success, China is not successful because it's communist. It is successful because it's renegotiated its relationship with foreign entrepreneurs, which is FDI, and domestic entrepreneurs. And that is why they have finally added mass prosperity, but they don't have mass democracy. See, India missed our tryst with destiny. So I think my next book may be about our next tryst with destiny, which is adding mass prosperity to mass democracy.
Fantastic, fantastic, Manish. We look forward to that book as well and to having another fireside chat with you when that book comes out. I wish we had more time to engage the audience much more, but what we will do is in future we will have panel discussions maybe on pharma tech, health tech, entrepreneurship in general, and then we would invite the audience to engage with you. But for those of you who are watching on the YouTube stream or on this channel right now, please do check out this book. It's an absolutely fantastic read, even if you're not from the pharmaceutical sector. Please check out the book. It's got very good stories about entrepreneurship, very good information on trends in this whole space, great lessons from the journey of a hard earned entrepreneurship company. And you can benefit from all of these insights from this fireside chat. Please do get in touch with Manish. If you ever see his name in any event as a speaker, please do go check him out and say hi to him. So, Manish, Thank you so much for this fantastic 1 hour of insightful discussion. All the best to you in your journeys. All the best to your whole team at Team Lease, at Lupin, and also at the publishers, Juggernaut. So, Manasvi, over to you now. Thank you. Thank you, Manish. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank
Uh,
you.
yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you, Manish. Thank you, Madan. Yeah, one second. Let me just quickly get one slide up. So, yep. I hope my screen is visible.
Not yet. I guess it's coming.
Uh, Second. Yep.
Yeah, it's come now.
Great. So, and special thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us in this fireside chat on Made in India, the story of D.B. Gupta, Lupin, and Indian Pharma. We look forward to welcoming you, or we look forward to welcoming you to other insightful sessions with leading authors, publishers of authors we have featured in our sessions, including Juggernaut Books, Penguin Random House, Harper Collins, HBR Press, Springer, MIT Press, and others. If you are an author, publisher, or LitFest organizer would like to be featured here, contact us at brand@mixer.world. And also, this session was being live recorded on YouTube and other social platforms. For other details on our activities in the innovation ecosystem, please check out our website